Welcome to the place where we learn about and learn from the leaders in our field who are powering human creativity. I am Aaron Dworkin, and this is Arts Engines. Thanks again for joining me here on Arts Engines. Today's guest is Dr. James Gandre, president of the Manhattan School of Music. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aaron. It is such a joy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it.
Well, and this is, especially rewarding for me. I've had the opportunity to know you for many years and to see your work firsthand, and your leadership, which I thought would be a really great thing for us to kind of focus on. We have, a lot of our audience are either aspiring leaders who hope to be in these leadership roles someday, and or are current leaders, but facing different challenges and all of that. And you've had just extraordinary, to just say, president of Manhattan would be, you've got Roosevelt, and you've a performer leading in performance literally all over the world, and you've literally kind of written the book and dissertation on what conservatories are in the field, and so I think that you are truly the expert. So I thought I would first kind of just start off with this sense about leadership when you're managing multiple points of view. And so what I mean by that is whether someone who's watching us is leading an orchestra or a community music school or a conservatory, public college, whatever it might be, that a lot of times you have these competing interests. You could have tenured musicians in an orchestra or tenured faculty. You have students, you have staff who are not tenured, et cetera. And that a lot of times the way in which you manage those different constituencies can be successful or can be rife with challenge. And so just wondering, kind of, as you look at that aspect, is there any kind of underlying principles you follow when you find that there are the competing interests and you have to lead and be respected by and engage with all of them and not just one of your constituencies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I always say to aspiring administrators is that you should ask yourself over and over again, why is it important that I am the whatever, the vice president of this or the president of that or the CEO of this at that particular institution? Because I think if you can't answer that question for yourself, then I think you should likely look for another post. And I've heard so many artists say to young artists, if you can do something else, do it. Don't do this job. I don't always fully agree with that sort of black and white kind of line. But I would say the similar thing to a young administrator. You've got to do this because you have to do it, not because you can. And I've seen so many administrators say to me, well, this is the next logical step. Or I've gotten the experience, now I can do this. And that's when I go back to, but why is it important that you do this? Why are you motivated? Is why must you do this? Because if you're doing it, otherwise you're going to run into trouble. The other thing I would say with this is to never take yourself too seriously. No matter what level you attain, you're always a servant to the people you lead. And I know that servant leader idea is some people may say it's hackneyed and overdone and whatever, but I really actually do believe that. And I think you are the servant of the people you lead, and you must always take into account their needs. And so that gets back to the sort of the beginning of your question, which was, how are the competing interests of the faculty, the staff, the board, excuse me. And, those are all, they can be very, very disparate differences between those, as I know you know very well. Normally over my career, and I've been in this business for almost 35 years, because I'm kind of old and creaky at this point, is that you almost always you can find something that fits everybody, but it's a lot of discussion. It's a lot of bringing people into understanding and challenging them and doing it, but not doing it in a heavy-handed way. But that discussion with the individual groups, I find almost always leads to some kind of common ground where you can get things done.
Awesome. Awesome. And I think definitely that finding, you know, that common ground. And I love what you shared about needing that underlying purpose, that meaning. You know, I've heard people talk about it with fundraising. They're like, oh, well, now I kind of learned how to fundraise and I know that's a part of this job. So now I can do it. And what I always talk about is, but what is really fundraising? And you have to look and say, what is going to, you know, compel me to do the repeated, you know, meetings and diligence, unless you know what it is you're fighting for. What is that mission? If you don't feel that drive to further your institution, then fundraising will not be a fun experience. Wondering, since fundraising, right, is always such a key part of so many leadership positions, any thoughts on that front?
Sure. So I think fundraising, you know, it's interesting. I've experienced people who come from fundraising machine institutions to another institution, like they were maybe associate vice president or something, and then they become vice president, and they're not nearly as good as they were at the previous institution, because I think sometimes their success was because of the institution in great part. And I'm not saying that's not taking away from their own skill, but you know, each institution has its own thing and its own history of fundraising. So when institutions have had a history of bad fundraising, sometimes boards will look for this so-called great fundraiser, and they bring them in. They're going to send them to Nirvana, and they're all going to be happy and sit on Olympus. And and it often doesn't happen because, one, the person doesn't necessarily love the institution and really understand it. Two, you have to set up an institution for success. So, for instance, we have had here a history of not always the best fundraising. And so when I came, one of the things I had to do was to show that we were a winning proposition in every way. Not just our history of producing some great artists, but really in how we function, how the budget works, how responsible we are, et cetera. And what's happened is, you know, in the last 5 years, we've raised more money than we ever raised before. But it took my first 3 years. I had to spend my time in my first 3 years sort of laying that groundwork. And so, again, I think unless you really love the place, like I truly love this institution. I've been here for 8 years, and I was here for 15 years, 13 years before that. And I came back because I do have a passion for this place, what it's about, the people I serve. And so it was a great joy to come back and to do that work. And so fundraising has been a joy, but it wasn't always, we had to lay the groundwork to have it be successful.
Yeah, and I so love that, is because like so many things, it's not a particular individual, and that role of a leader, if the infrastructure doesn't exist, to build that fundraising infrastructure. And then on top of that, you go and do the things that a leader would do. But absent of that infrastructure, it's going to be so difficult. I think that's such a great approach. So thinking about that type of approach, obviously, certainly what's been big in many leaders' minds this past year are all things DE&I. And so just wondering, right, there's certainly a lot of people I know who are either at institutions where they may not be in the top leadership role and feel frustrated about either a lack of change or evolution, those types of things, or are the leader and feel frustrated at the lack of pace of change, because whether it's the institution or the various constituency groups and the fact that they don't want to move, and you can be the leader but still not move things forward. Wondering your thoughts about actually bringing about substantive evolution for an institution related to DE&I.
So 2 years ago, we started something we called the Cultural Inclusion Initiative. And part of that was to begin to have discussions with our faculty and our students about what inclusion meant and how they need to change the way they did things. So part of that was we created a curriculum sort of a restart curriculum group, which was to not just to put courses that represent underrepresented people, but to actually infuse inclusion throughout the curriculum. Because I think if it just gets, these 10 courses and you can say, oh, good, I checked that off and we're good, it's not bad. It's better than nothing, but it's not the way that I think you actually change an institution. So then this last year, after George Floyd and all the other heinous murders that unfortunately not new, but they came in a group that we and they had so much publicity that we actually, within about 5 days, I went from having a discussion about something new, which we call the Black Creators Project, to just sending a memo to the institution to the community saying, we are going to do this. And what that meant was that there had to be a creator of African-American descent or from the African diaspora who is part of every single performance we did. So, excuse me. So what that meant was mostly composers, but that wasn't always the case. Sometimes it was directors or dramaturgs or choreographers or whatever it might be, depending on the discipline. And then we also, and that was, I can't tell you how many wonderful messages I got from faculty and students, excuse me, allergies, saying that how much this meant to them and how much they grew because of it and how much they changed and how much they didn't understand. We had faculty members in some of we had dozens and dozens of events and workshops here for faculty and students. And so we had dozens and dozens of events and workshops here on the school, and which touch hundreds and hundreds of people within our community. Because we have a community of about 1,800 people with our faculty, students, staff, et cetera. And when I got those wonderful unsolicited emails from people or a stop in the hall that said, thank you for doing this. I was blind. I didn't see things. I know that I've done microaggressions and now I know better. And I feel so horrible that I did that. And at the same time, not vilifying them, because the reality is that was sort of, unfortunately, the norm. And so I think that this year, what we're doing is we're going to do what we had planned in the third year of our cultural inclusion initiative, which is to expand this to be Latinx, Arab, Asian, women, LGBTQI, so that, but looking perhaps more in departments so that, for instance, in classical music, it might be more Latinx and African-American, Black. In jazz, it might be women and LGBTQI because they're less represented in those. So not having a cookie cutter approach to every single genre, but saying where is there something that's lacking in these various places.
Well, it's just extraordinary work. And I could just imagine if every, music school in the country was taking these steps within a few very short years, literally the landscape would look so different. So thank you for your
thank you.
In that area. So unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I kind of always like to ask from our leaders, especially relating to leadership principles, these things can get tough, right? I'm sure, you get pushback on some of the leadership things you're doing. Where do you draw on for strength, for inspiration in the toughest of times?
So there are really two things. Well, three, I would say, actually. I'm going to add a third thing to this. So the first is my students. I get so much inspiration from them. I live on campus. So we have two large-ish buildings for a school of 1,000. And I live in the residence hall. My husband and I do. And so I see them really regularly, and then going backstage, et cetera, talking to the halls, asking them how the Strauss is going. How did you like playing Adolphus Hailstork's piece on that chamber music concert that you were just on? And did you know that he was an alum also? And those kinds of interactions, when it's about music or when it's just about, I don't know, whatever it might be, are just, they propel me through the incredibly stressful and sometimes just never-ending job. And that goes back to what I said earlier about you must be able to do this, because if you're not, you're going to just tire out. You're going to completely peter out and not be able to do the job. The second thing is my husband. We've been together for 24 years, and he's just a constant rock and support for me. And then lastly, the thing I added was my garden. So one of the things that we're lucky to have in the president's residence here on campus is there's a very large terrace. And so I have this very large garden with about 100 different plants and trees and things on it. And you'll have to come see it. And it's something that allows me to get away from it all and sort of put my hands in dirt, see things change and grow. And no one talks back. No one asks me questions. That evergreen tree just does not ask any questions. So it's a wonderful refuge.
Wow. Well, that sounds totally, totally amazing. And I know on my home front, Ava loves her garden, which has tripled in size since the pandemic. So
yes,
definitely. Well, Jim Gandre, you truly are one of the arts engines who is powering human creativity in our world. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for everything you're doing.